Welcome to Myanmar Musings, a podcast of the Myanmar Research Centre at the Australian National University, Canberra. It's the 22nd of October 2021, and today we're bringing you another syndicated podcast episode from the Asea Research News Network. This podcast is a result of the Knowledge for Democracy Myanmar initiative, jointly supported by Global Affairs Canada and the International Development Research Centre, the IDRC. So please enjoy the next 30 minutes with your experts Mesabe Pugh, Minzo U, and Alexander Pelletier discussing democracy and decentralisation in Myanmar.
Only when everyone in the society enjoy equal rights and opportunities, and only then we will be living with peace.
We have elements of religious conflict. We have the elements of ethnicity, and we also have the elements of natural resources, economic disparity. So all these issues are intertwined and impacted by the ongoing conflict as well. The violence generate more structured violence and also more grievances.
Of course, war is disrupting local communities. It's also disrupting the economy. It's also disrupting family life. It's disruptive of norms and values on the ground. So war has huge consequences for local communities.
The 2021 military coup brought Myanmar dramatically back into the international headlines. It was a big setback for a country that had spent 10 years as a democracy. But it was only the latest episode in the country's ongoing history of strife and uncertainty.
Myanmar citizens turned out by the millions to protest the February 1st coup that ousted the democratically elected government of Aung San Suu Kyi. But the protests have dwindled amid a harsh military crackdown.
My name is Stephen Dale, and this is an Asea Research News podcast. On this podcast, we'll hear from international and local researchers who have been working with Canada's International Development Research Centre through its Knowledge for Democracy Myanmar initiative. They had been exploring how decentralization of political power might provide a more stable foundation for life in Myanmar. Their work was brought to an abrupt end by the February coup. Still, their findings provide powerful insights into the web of circumstances that have fueled conflict in the country. And their policy recommendations provide a potential blueprint for positive change should a democratic opening emerge in the future. Minzo U is Executive Director of the Myanmar Institute for Peace and Security. He's been dealing with Myanmar's complexities for decades as a peace negotiator. But he began as a combatant. In the 1980s, Minzo U worked with groups opposing the military junta and
I also joined the armed resistance movement called All Burma Students Democratic Front, ABSDF. And I was a guerrilla fighter for 4 years in the jungle. And later, I came to the United States and I received my education here and I made my career in security field, research, and other international development. And I was exiled for 21 years until the new government in 2011 invited me to return to the country to support the peace process. After the elections in 2015, there was a new government led by the former opposition National League for Democracy, NLD. And the NLD, led by Aung San Suu Kyi, tried to implement the peace process.
while studying for his doctorate at George Mason University in the United States, Minzo U arrived at the conclusion that new democracies are inherently unstable. In order to succeed, they need additional support.
A lot of political scientists said if a country experienced democracy for 15 years, it can consolidate democracy. But in reality, it did not. Most countries transitioned after 1955, could not consolidate democracy. So they remain a weak democracy for many countries. So when Myanmar transitioned to democracy in 2011, I did not have expectation that Myanmar could become a consolidated democracy. My worry was Myanmar could reverse to some form of autocracy despite the attempt for democratizations. So for that reason, in order to prevent the reversal from the democratic process, the peace process must be a safety net for the country to move forward democratization in the middle of emerging factionalism.
The most essential work to support a fledgling democracy, says Min Zau, is to get the country's factions talking about how to resolve the core issues that underlie conflict.
A peace process cannot just simply ceasefire. It has to address the underlying root causes of the armed conflict. So these root causes, the self-determination of ethnic people, equal rights, and also the democratic institutions in different parts of the country. So for the reason, when we facilitated the negotiation of the nationwide ceasefire agreements, we carefully crafted a process for political dialogue, because without political dialogue, the peace process will be hard to sustain.
And this is where the research on decentralization comes in. Myanmar's centralized power structure has fueled conflict in this very diverse country, where minorities have had very little access to power. Resolving this issue has long been recognized as a key to securing a lasting peace. This is Alexandre Pelletier. He was co-investigator on the project with a team from the University of Toronto.
The core issue in Myanmar in the last 50 years has been the way the state is organized. So Myanmar has been at war with itself. So there's been a one of the world's longest running civil war between the state and regional ethnic minorities. So Myanmar is composed of 135 ethnic groups, but 7 main larger ethnic groups located in the periphery of the state. So you have the Chin, Kachin, Karen, Shan, Mon, Rakhine, Kaya people, which are kind of the larger umbrella ethnic minorities located in the periphery of the state. And these groups have been asking for greater decentralization for the last 50 years. They've been asking for federalism, basically. And some of them have been at war with the central government, asking for more rights and more autonomy on issues of culture, but also on issues of natural resources, or basically greater autonomy in deciding of their own political future. So that's the core issue in Myanmar. When we talk about a civil war in Myanmar, it's really about those ethnic minorities asking for greater autonomy and power. So that's one aspect of the issue. That's one of the rationale for implementing greater decentralization is to kind of respond to grievances by ethnic minority groups. And then there's also other rationales. For example, since the 1980s and 1990s, decentralization has been a core agenda of the international community in democratizing countries. It is believed that decentralization is going to facilitate democratization.
But how does this theoretical idea play out at the community level?
Our part of the project was to look at decentralization in Myanmar, the implementation of more decentralized policies in transitional Myanmar and its effect on local communities. But also the goal was also to take stock of whether decentralization happened at all in Myanmar over the last government or so. So the goal was to kind of evaluate whether there were policies implemented and what were the effect of those policies on local communities, but also some of the challenges in implementing those policies.
Decentralization was supposed to be a central part of establishing a new democratic order in Myanmar. However,
what we realized through research is that just how little actual decentralization happen in the last decade of democratic reforms. So what we've seen is the creation of local parliament. That's one step. That's one first step for decentralization. But very little constitutional power were given to those local government through the 2008 constitution. So basically, they are governments, but they have little power. So the central government remains extremely powerful in most areas that would, in other federations, be given to federated states. For example, education, healthcare, which are generally powers that are given to local governments. But what we see in Myanmar is very little power. Those powers are not given to the states. Basically, those powers are the central government gives administrative power to local states, but very little decision power in terms of where we allocate resources, what we do with those resources, what are the priorities at local level. Very little of that have been given to local governments. So we've seen examples, just anecdotes. A local hospital need more chair for the waiting room. But they have to go to the capital to get those chairs, right? So they don't even have a local budget, and the local government doesn't have power to decide on those priorities. And then they have to go to Naypyidaw, the Myanmar's capital, to get more chairs. So it just gives an idea of the extent to which little decentralization actually happened on the ground. That's the first problem. So very little decentralization. Most of the powers are kept in the hands of the central government. But still, there is some move toward greater decentralization. And I think this is where, democracy and greater democratic power is undetermined in terms of outcomes. Because once you give power to local governments, they start asking for more power. That's normal, right? And through this through this political game, they were able in some cases to gain a little bit more power and assume new responsibilities. But in general, what we found is that the general pattern was very, very little actual decentralization at the local level.
Min Za-u says real decentralization requires specific measures that will give state and local governments the capacity to implement their own decisions.
In order for the decentralization to be effective, so the human resource management need to also be decentralized. The budgeting also need to be decentralized. The state government needs to be a lot bigger than what it is right now. So that there are a lot of the catch-22 situations. But on the other hand, the decentralization will require much more funding, probably at least 30% of more government expenditures than what it is right now. Because making the state government bigger means we need more government expenditures in this regard. So these are some of our rough findings.
A big part of the problem is money. To truly have power, local and regional governments need bigger budgets and control over how funds are spent.
The state government, when they have to implement the budgeting, they have very little room because the budget coming from the union level to the state government is pretty much fixed and no leeway for the state government to move around. Another issue is the resources of the state government. State governments are very small. And one ministry of the state government may handle 16 different units, and the minister may have only 5 people to assist him.
The failure to meaningfully shift power away from the central government was one way in which the promise of a new democratic era was falling short.
There were a lot of expectations from the minorities when the NLD government came to power. They expected there could have been more decentralization under the NLD government. But that was the opposite of what happened. So there were also some disenchantment from the ethnic minorities in this regard.
Alongside this disappointing lack of effective measures to decentralize, there were other ominous signs that Myanmar's fledgling democracy was in trouble.
During the NLD regime, the peace process has become weaker, and the factionalism between the military and NLD has become more significant and become more obvious. So the safety net was pretty much broken at that time. So now we are in another phase of the military rule and back to square one.
Alexandre Pelletier says the current turn of events did not come as a complete surprise.
The regime, the junta, designed the 2008 constitution to maintain most of the power at the center. So they agreed to share some power with opposition parties, in this case the NLD, Aung San Suu Kyi's party. But they always maintained checks on that power, right? So in parliament, there's always 25% of the seats that are from the military, and the military maintains key control over key ministries. So it's less a democracy than a power sharing scheme between the military and civil parties or civil forces. So it's always been the case. So that's one reason why it's not surprising that the military, when it felt that the civil forces or democratic forces were gaining too much strength, for in this case the re-election of Aung San Suu Kyi with much higher numbers than anybody thought that the party would get. That's why the military started to fear that this would go too far. So there were always profound and strong checks on how far the reform would go in Myanmar. And decentralization was part of that. The central government, the regime, always wanted to keep strong power or authority over the periphery. And basically, it wanted to keep authority over border, commerce, but also natural resources. And what we've seen is, in many cases where you've got civil war, one of the way of settling a civil war is to give greater power, especially control over natural resources, to the regions, because it's one of the major source of income, and that's one way to provide autonomy. But in Myanmar, we've seen very, very little of that. So decentralization is victim of the same apprehension that the military has toward democratization. That is, it's afraid that these reforms would go too far. And the February coup is basically the military saying it's over. It's enough for now. Let's go back to the drawing table, and let's just make sure we are not losing power here. And that's what we will see in the next few years, probably, is that either the constitution will be rewritten, or the NLD, the opposition party, will be banned, or something like that will allow the military to be confident enough to play again the democratic game and allow for some reforms.
This kind of political gamesmanship has real impacts in the lives of Myanmar's citizens. People can no longer enjoy the freedoms that came with democracy. The character of everyday life has changed as the country moves deeper into civil war. Recent economic gains have been wiped out.
The military coup effectively halted this current peace process. On the political front, the democratic institutions like the parliament have been pretty much collapsed, and the civil society are now disarray. Like many thousands of people working in the civil society become the opposition, and some joined the armed resistance movement. A lot of young people, they also joined the resistance movement. So people who are supposed to be in the workforce, engineers, doctors, IT technicians, a lot of them became the resistance fighters. The impact of the economy is very significant. Economic development was reduced at least 20%.
Citizen video shows coffins and corpses wrapped in blankets lined up at a crematorium in Myanmar's largest city. Family members are waiting for their deceased loved ones to be cremated. The grisly scene comes as COVID-19 deaths soar in Yangon, overwhelming crematoriums, cemeteries, and hospitals.
It's also significant that the coup was staged in the middle of the COVID-19 crisis. The combined impacts of the coup and COVID have been catastrophic. This is May Sabe Piu. She is the director of Myanmar's Gender Equality Network.
The coup has ended all the COVID-19 recovery efforts and instead pushed Myanmar deeper into economic crisis, right? So the recent UNDP report has estimated that unless the situation returns to normal in the coming weeks, an additional 12 million people in Myanmar will slip back into extreme poverty. And this would mean that nearly 50% of the population of the country would be living in extreme poverty, a level not seen since 2005. Of course, UNDP also notes that women and children will bear the brunt of this loss in human development. And to illustrate this point, before the COVID-19 crisis, the government sector employed 900,000 workers, more than 85% of them are women. And due to the COVID-19 crisis, 200,000 of these jobs were lost. And now, due to the coup, another 200,000 jobs have been lost, meaning that approximately 300,000 to 400,000 women have lost their livelihood in just 1 year in just one sector. It is quite worrying.
Although this turmoil is a recent development in Myanmar's urban areas, a state of crisis is nothing new in many of the country's remote rural areas, where conflict remained the norm throughout the democratic era. Alexandre Pelletier says that a normal life has been elusive for many of Myanmar's ethnic minorities.
When you live in insecurity, for example, having access to schools, having access to work is much more difficult. If you cannot travel outside your village, that's a huge problem. And also when you have to flee your village because you fear being recruited in one armed group, or you fear for your life, it also disrupts local families. And when you've been experiencing displacement, because one of the greatest aside from death, one of the greatest consequences of war is displacement. So thousands and thousands of people in Myanmar live in internally displaced people's camp. So they are not living in their village. They don't have access to their land. They don't have access to their housing and means of earning incomes. And in some regions of Myanmar, people have been living in camps for years and decades. And there's little hope of going back to the communities because war is raging in some of those areas. So it's very difficult in those camps to get access to schooling, but also to get access to income.
And in remote ethnic regions, what looks on the outside like economic development is actually an appendage of the military conflict. The war economy has a logic of its own, and it has little to do with serving the needs of the population.
The building of roads, for example, are meant to bring the army vehicles, for example, into the ethnic regions rather than provide roads for local development. And what we've seen as well is that those roads have been used for the central government to exploit natural resources in many cases. In some ethnic minority regions, we see basically mountains have disappeared because they've been exploited for minerals, for example. We have also seen forests being torn down for lumber, for example. And so we've seen that in many, many areas where natural resources have been depleted.
The struggle for democracy in Myanmar has played out over many decades. It's unlikely it will stop now. Moving forward, it will be impossible to ignore the root causes of the conflicts that have raged across many generations' lifetimes, says Alexandre Pelletier.
The problems are the exact same as before, and there's no way out of the current situation without addressing the democratic aspect, but also the place of the ethnic minorities in Myanmar's broader national identity. So it's either federalism or greater decentralization. It has to address those grievances by ethnic minorities, or the war will continue. And that's what we've seen in the last 50 years, is that there's been no credible offers to resolve those problems.
For now, the future is uncertain. But Min Zaw believes that if a democratic opening does emerge in Myanmar, somewhere over the horizon, this work on decentralization could be useful in future efforts to move the country towards peace.
If the peace process coming back to life again, yes, this research will be beneficial to those negotiators. Our finding will allow the parties to draw a blueprint how a federal state can be structured in the future. What kind of authorities, power, and resources the state government need to be provided in order to make it effectively a federal state.
The reinstatement of military rule in Myanmar appears, in some ways, like a return to the 1990s, after the Tatmadaw had quashed the democratic uprising of the late 80s. But there are significant differences. Today, for example, Myanmar's people know what it's like to live in a more open society.
After 2011, there was a significant liberalization of efforts and the press freedom and the freedom of expressions. So that may not be the standard of Western democracies, but compared to other Asian countries, we have quite decent liberalizations people enjoy in the period between 2011 and 2021. This is also another reason people could not accept the military rule when the military launched a coup, because people already enjoyed that period. And there was also relative economic growth around that time as well. So people felt, our life was better, our freedoms were better, but the military coup took away all these progress.
They've grown used to the freedom they gained in the last 10 years, right? They've gained a lot. 10 years ago, it was just impossible to surf the internet or have cell phone, or, it was just those things were banned. Nowadays, everybody, Myanmar is one of the largest growing market for social media, if not the largest in the region. People went from no phone to smartphone, and from no internet to surfing the web on their smartphone. So the changes were drastic in the last 10 years. The changes were so profound that I don't think people are ready to abandon those things just yet. And I think this is an interesting point here, is that the junta or the military seem to have underestimated its population. The population of Myanmar is not the same in 2021 that it was in the 1990s. They've experienced, they've tasted democracy. They've been exposed to what's going on outside of the country. Prior to the 1990s, the country was extremely closed, so it was very difficult. So it was much easier for the junta to control the population back then than it is today. And that's one reason why you see so much opposition from younger generations in Myanmar right now to the coup than you used to see.
May Sabe Piyu is encouraged by a generational shift in attitudes. She believes it makes people less likely to let go of the advances made by women during the period of democratization.
We are seeing a lot of positive changes in our younger generations, right? So the revolution is led by the Generation Z, and they are more open, and they have more positive view on gender equality, and they valued women's participation. So we are hoping that the gender equality agenda, the issue of women meaningful participation in all levels of our society, it could take place.
Knowledge for Democracy Myanmar is a joint initiative of Canada's International Development Research Centre and Global Affairs Canada. Its purpose is to support public policy research in Myanmar. This podcast is produced by Asea Research News. I'm Stephen Dale. Thanks for listening.